Thank you, and thanks for joining us again this morning. So there's some really interesting, good questions, and I'll do my best to answer them, but if they generate any more questions, then do let us know. So someone asked, what does species diversity mean? So species diversity, which is often also referred to as biodiversity, it's the range of animals and plants in a place. And if the numbers of one animal or plant are affected, then often there's a effect on the other animals and plants that live in the same place. So for example, if plants in a pond get a disease, then that might also affect the fish and the birds living there because they might rely on that plant for food. Someone also asked what retrofitting buildings mean.
No, well, it kind of. I got no picture now.
And so retrofitting buildings just means the changes that we need to make to existing buildings to reduce the energy needed to live or work or use those buildings. So, for example, putting insulation in your house or putting solar panels on the roof are all examples of retrofitting buildings, but you'll hear more about that later this weekend. So net zero carbon, that's a phrase that you might hear a lot. It is on the slides that I gave, so you do refer back to that, but I'll say again what it means. Essentially, it just means that there are things that we do that put greenhouse gases, so gases that cause climate change, into the air. So for example, when you drive a petrol car, out of your exhaust comes some greenhouse gases that contribute to climate change. So we put some gases into the atmosphere, but there are things that also happen that take some of those gases out. For example, trees growing removes some of those gases from the atmosphere. And what we need to do is we need to balance the things that put greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and the things that take greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. But Richard Betts is going to talk to you later today about the climate science, and so it should become a bit clearer for you. Someone asked, what made it an emergency? Where did the term come from? I think that's a really good question. So to give you a bit of background, some people have been worried about climate change for many, many years. But in 2018, an international group of scientists known as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, published a report on the latest science, and they said the world must act much more urgently to address climate change. More specifically, they said that we must reduce greenhouse gases globally by at least 45% by 2030 from the level they were at 2010. And we must get greenhouse gases down to net zero by 2050 if we're to avoid the worst effects of climate change, because doing so would keep the global temperature average below 1.5 degrees of warming. So just to highlight, they said we need to reduce emissions by 45% by 2030. Obviously, that's only 10 years, and they're basically asking us to halve emissions. But at the time that they said that, and still, global emissions are still rising. So people said, okay, this is an emergency. We've not got much time, and we need to halve emissions. So in Devon, and around the world, this report caused a lot of attention and a lot of worry. And so in May 2019 in Devon, at the request of councillors, a meeting was called, bringing together the organisations that usually respond to emergencies in Devon. So for example, the police, the NHS, the Environment Agency and local councils, as well as other organisations that have relevance to tackling climate change. So those 27 organisations came together and they formed the Devon Climate Emergency Partnership, and they declared a climate emergency and said, let's do something about it. So another question was, why are we focusing on these three challenges that we're going to talk more about this weekend? So I won't go into detail now, but I'll just say that Patrick is going to explain further how we got to narrowing down to this point. And hopefully if you've had a look at the summary of the carbon plan, that might help you understand that as well. And the other questions on the topics, so on mobility, wind and retrofitting buildings, they're going to be talked about more, so you'll have a chance to ask more questions. Someone asked, what impact will we have? What can we steer? So as Phil Norrie, the CEO of Devon County Council said, and he's also the chair of the Devon Climate Emergency Partnership, all the organisations of the Devon Climate Emergency Partnership are really interested to hear what your recommendations are on these issues, because they want to understand what are the preferences in Devon and the appetite for change for tackling these issues, because there are some different options that we can take. And so your recommendations will help to choose what we do about those options. So it very much will have an impact. Someone asked, should we be ambitious or should we be realistic and limited by the current limitations? Please be ambitious, because to be straight, addressing net zero is going to require a substantial amount of change, both in behaviour change and changes to society more broadly, as well as technological change. But I think if you look at how much we've changed really quickly in response to the pandemic, you can begin to imagine that actually, when we collectively decide that we have to make some changes, we can make quite big, significant changes quite quickly. So do be ambitious. Don't think about just how we do things now. You know, even the use of the internet has totally transformed our lives over the last few decades. So things can be different to how we experience them now. Someone asked, how can we keep youth involved? Because we did have the engage with you with we had a youth conference in the evidence gathering phase, but people want to know how can we keep them involved. So we agree this is really important. We're in regular contact with the Devon Youth Parliament, and we've supported them recently in some of their campaigns that they wanted to do and competitions. And we've also had some meetings with youth climate campaigners, called a group called Fridays for the Futures. And we're also planning some further engagement with schools, including creating some resources based on this citizens' assembly. So they're going to see some shorter videos that explain what happened in the citizens' assembly, and then they'll have some questions that they could respond to. And we've been meeting with some teachers to try and explore how we can better work with schools. There was a request that that the papers should be covering this more, and we should use that to better spread news. So we are going to be releasing some press releases, and I believe at some point some of you might get asked as to whether you would be interested to participate in that. And there's absolutely no obligation to be involved in that, but some of you might wish to be. So we are going to be letting the local newspapers know that this is something we're talking about. And there was other questions about, can we trust the evidence? And I think there's going to be more guidance on critical thinking and sort of how we look at what evidence we're being presented later. But I would say that we've tried as far as possible to present you with a range of evidence, but feel free to ask the speakers about where they're getting their information from, what their experience is.
Yep. So we'll be picking up on some of that critical thinking and directly after Emily finishes. So just got another maybe a minute there if there are a couple of other key questions that we want to finish up with.
Yeah, so there's just one more sort of major sort of grouping of questions about the 2050 target. So someone asked, where are we at the moment with regards to reaching net zero by 2050? So since 2010, the emissions produced in Devon, so not the emissions associated with things we buy made in factories outside of Devon, but the emissions produced in Devon have reduced by 20%, and Exeter University came up with those figures for us. So that means that Devon is almost halfway to reducing emissions by 45% by 2030 from the 2010 levels. So that was the recommendation from that group of scientists, the International Panel on Climate Change. So we're about halfway to where we need to be by 2030. Why is the date net zero by 2050? Well, again, that's the recommendation of the International Panel on Climate Change in order to keep warming below 1.5 degrees. But it's also the recommendation of an organisation called the Committee on Climate Change, which advises the UK government on what we should do about climate change. And on the advice of the Committee on Climate Change, the UK government legally committed to the target of achieving net zero by 2050. So it is in law that the UK needs to achieve net zero by 2050. So it's a big challenge. It's not very long. So some people might say, is it really feasible? Is it realistic? But the Committee on Climate Change has set out nationally in a lot of detail what we need to do to get to net zero by then. And we've worked with Exeter University to say, okay, what do the national recommendations mean for Devon? And there are reports on our website that give more detail on that. And that's what we've tried to base the carbon plan on, in combination with advice from the public and local experts on what this means for Devon. And Exeter University have also produced carbon budgets for us, saying every 5 years how much budget of emissions we've got and how much the emissions need to have reduced.
And we'll be hearing a lot more about really what that means and this sort of climate science. So don't worry if some of that doesn't quite make sense yet, but we will be hearing a lot more about that as we go through today. So Emily, is there that's where we're at to now? There were a few other questions, but a lot of them
more or less, those were the main ones, I think.
Great. So thank you, Emily. And it's important when we do have these outstanding questions that sort of affect how you're able to then think about what we're doing at the next stage, that you do let us know via the facilitators or just via contact with the support team in the background, and we can try and make sure that the information that you need is given to you.